things that we have, bring all the
Sorry.
things of the difficult things that we've talked about into some kind of perspective in terms of what has happened in the next chapter of the story for Canadian society, and where do we both as a society and as Christian disciples go with the story that we've been exploring. So I'm going to click share screen. I always forget exactly how to do this. I'll share it, but then I will put up the presentation and you can tell me if you can see. Okay, can you see the slideshow okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Yep, we can see it.
All right, so
Good.
tonight, great, good. So tonight we're going to try and explore change and several concepts that really will help us think into the new day, if you will, in very concrete ways. So I wanted to just frame for us some questions because we are going to look at change tonight. So we want to understand a little bit about how change happened in Canadian society, but also what further change is needed from here. I want to look a little bit about our social imaginary question. We talked about that in our first week in terms of the social imaginary of the Canadian mosaic and what happened with that in terms of the story of race, and introduce an idea of a new social imaginary that takes us beyond the question of multiculturalism. And then at the very end, I want us to look at anti-racism and anti-racism practices and the meaning of equity and ask ourselves, what does all of that have to do with Christian proclamation of the good news? In my view, it has everything to do with it, but I want us just to explore some ideas about that from there as a way of trying to think into the questions that we've been struggling with. So the scripture passage we said right from the beginning that would be our passage for tonight is Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this age. Oops, sorry, I have to just go back. I'm trying to just move. I'm just going to minimize the photos. There we go. I couldn't see the text. Sorry for a moment. Do not be conformed to this age. This age, no. But be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And I want to just pause in that. I think this is a perfect passage for us to be contemplating as we ask ourselves a question of what next, but also as we prepare for Pentecost. We've been taking this journey from Easter to Pentecost. And I think if there was ever a passage for Pentecost that invites us into a new way of being in the world in the Spirit of God, this one is it. Especially in light of the kind of difficult material that we've been dealing with. If we can think differently, if we can allow our ideas and our mind to be challenged in new ways, then the pouring out of the Spirit of God to lead us into a new way of understanding, and from a new way of understanding into a new way of being, really becomes possible for us. So this is the passage that I invite us just to keep running at the back of our mind as we consider what we want to look at tonight. So we're going to talk about how change happened here. And it's my view that change for Canada really began through the initiative of the global context. Things did not change in Canada first. We really followed the international stage. And if we're looking at where things changed for the world, we really, in the Western world in particular, we have to go back to 1948. After the end of the Second World War, with the formation of the United Nations, one of the earliest projects of the United Nations was to come up with a universal declaration of human rights. And it's from this that the whole way of thinking about who are human beings, what are our obligations to other human beings, what are the rights of all human beings, what does it mean to be human on a global stage, really were grappled with in the global arena. So I've just flagged a few of these that I think become very important in the Canadian story and the Canadian consciousness. So first, Article 3 from that declaration, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. And as we've seen, of course, from the story of Canada and race, unfortunately, many groups of people have been subjected to many forms of inhumanity, cruelty, and degrading treatment. Finally, Article 25. I've written it here in its totality for us. especially with reference to Indigenous communities and newcomer communities who are living in very complicated situations. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. Pardon the exclusive language, it was 1948, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the strengthening of a respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. And of course, that's particularly relevant for us in relation to the whole story of residential schools that has unfolded in Canada. So Canada is a part of this world stage, and it is, generally speaking, historically understood itself to be a fairly socially aware nation, a fairly liberal nation in terms of its ideological place on the political spectrum. And so Canadian leaders started to talk about the importance of having some form of Bill of Rights here that modeled itself on the principles and ideas of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So I picked an interesting image. I'm trying with my images to make my point. So if you forget the words, you'll remember the image. Har, the lion with his big teeth. We have a Bill of Rights. It's great. It roars onto the stage. But in the end, the Canadian Bill of Rights actually had no teeth to it, and so did not affect the kind of social change that I think those who gave leadership in developing it hoped it would have. So the Bill of Rights then it was a bill passed in Parliament, but it had no legal standing in the sense that it did not affect the constitutional rights of our population. So it was an act for the recognition and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It was passed by our Parliament, affirming that the Canadian nation, this is very interesting, even in this last 70 years to see the difference, is founded upon principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God. I find that very interesting in light of the very widespread affirmation of the importance of secularism as a necessary basis for a diverse and plural society that we see now in Canada. Continuing then, and the dignity and worth of the human person and the position of the family in a society of free people and free institutions. Also affirming that all people and institutions remain free only when freedom is founded upon respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law. Well, what we're going to see is that the courts were not able to enforce this in the way that would become later possible in terms of the constitutional processes. But the phrase I want to pull out from this is actually the rule of law, because what we're going to see in the Canadian context, that without the court system, without judicial processes, our ability to move into a genuinely respectful, diverse society where the rights and freedoms of all are protected would have been impossible. So it's to that story of how judicial change happened that we really just want to look now. So there were changes in the Canadian judicial system that were quite important towards leading to the state that we find ourselves in now, where we have a legal system which really is quite vigilant in protecting rights and freedoms. So we see then that prior to the Second World War, questions had already been emerging which challenged the assumptions of legalized discrimination by race. Interestingly, though, these questions were not raised by a white majority. They were being raised by folks who were persecuted, so that we see particularly in the Black community and in the Jewish community, questions were arising in the court systems about legalized racism, which we've talked about. I mean, the establishment of in our earlier sessions, legalized racism in Canada. But those questions were not, for the most part, being raised by the majority culture. But in 1949, so a year after the United Nations is underway with its reflection on human rights, something very important happened, which is that the final court of appeal for the Canadian judicial processes shifted away from Britain and to Canada. So prior to that, the highest court in Canada was in Britain. It was in the British Privy Council. But in 1949, the Supreme Court of Canada became the final resting place for judicial decision-making and legal processes. And that meant that Canada then saw its court system system as considerably empowered to make decisions about what was going to happen in terms of protecting the rights and freedoms of individuals in a very significant way. But real change, really, we don't see it until 1982. The Bill of Rights, because it was a bill and not enshrined in any constitutional story, was limited. But in 1982, we see that the Constitution of Canada is repatriated. In other words, the British North America Act, which had been developed in conversation with Britain, of course, originally, actually came home. Canada developed, negotiated with the provinces, and you'll remember all of this, the Meech Lake Accord and all of those many processes that were a part of that conversation, developed their own constitutional framework and became their own authority for understanding what the framework for living as a Canadian would fully be. So then in the repatriation of the Constitution, we see Section 52, that the Constitution as circa 1982 now is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is, to the extent of the inconsistency, of no force or effect. In other words, if some law that exists at any level within Canadian society, at any level, is not consistent with the commitments of the Constitution, it will be considered ineffective, or in other words, subject to being overturned. So it's important for us to understand partly why our Canadian Constitution is really at the heart of one of the ways in which we are going to sort ourselves out into being the kind of nation that we have talked about wanting to be for many decades. And that is because of the kind of Constitution that the Canadian Constitution is circa 1982. Constitutional theorists talk about it as a living tree. In other words, it is not an unwritten constitution, which some countries have. It is written down, and as such, because it's written down, it can be relied upon as a non-negotiable baseline for legal challenges when people are treated unfairly or laws are passed which are not consistent with the rights and freedoms protected in the Constitution. So it's written, which is good, not unwritten, which many countries have unwritten, but it's also not like the American Constitution. The American Constitution, and we see this playing out in all kinds of legal challenges currently, one of them being Roe versus Wade, it is not an originalist constitution. So the American Constitution is quite rigid. It is originalist. In other words, it can be changed through legal adaptation as the society changes, in a very limited way only. Because it has, any change or adaptation to the Constitution has to be understood as consistent with what the framers of the original Constitution in the 18th century actually wanted. So that means that room for new voices to shape it are very limited. It has to be in keeping with an 18th century view of the world. The Canadian Constitution is not like that. It changes, it grows, it adds new branches, it adapts and can be shaped as society itself changes. So as part of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have Section 1, which is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as part of the Constitutional Act of 1982. So what this Section 1 of the Constitution, which is the Charter, guarantees are the rights and freedoms for all Canadians. So it sets these out and is subject really only to the reasonable limit prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So we see as Section 1 rolls out that the notion of a free society and a democratic society, which means the majority rules, effectively, the majority opinion rules are going to be the guidelines by which this living tree constitution adapts. So Section 15 then in the Charter is very interesting. It talks about equality rights. So in this Section 15, it says that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. So this section then as a constitutional principle, guarantees the right for all of us to live free of discrimination based on these categories. And if we are discriminated against, we are able to take legal recourse to try and either change the law or the harm that has been done to us. So then we have the framework changed. Circa 1982, we see a very different Canadian landscape. We still are carrying forward the idea of the mosaic and the idea of multiculturalism, but now we have a legal commitment as a nation to protection of diversity for all who come, including newcomers and Indigenous people, that the country can be held accountable to. So what we see then, how did the story go for all the communities that we looked at in our first two sessions that were so oppressed in so many ways? What has happened since 1982? That would be another whole book to track that and look at it. But what we want to do is just make some broad generalizations. And in the book Space for Race, we talk about it more specifically. But effectively, all of the newcomer communities which we've discussed have thrived in many ways. When you look at statistics, you see that the rates of higher education are higher among newcomer groups, Asian, South Asian, Jewish communities, Black communities, that in terms of median incomes and relative affluence, there's a higher medium income level. There's a higher participation rate in white collar professions among the groups that we considered in our first 2 weeks. In other words, all are higher than the Canadian average. That's really a good news story. What about First Nations folks? Well, we see an increasing awareness of issues in mainstream Canadian society. We see growing Indigenous leadership movements, which are advocating for justice for First Nations communities. It's much more in the public consciousness, particularly, I mean, we had the TRC with its 94 recommendations, but really a year ago in Kamloops, when the first unmarked graves were found, we've seen really a coming awake in Canadian consciousness about the story of not only injustice done to Indigenous communities, but the impact of colonization on generations of Indigenous folks and their children, and also the criminal acts which were committed against Indigenous communities in whole varieties of ways. So there's been a real movement forward in terms of awareness. We see that many land claims issues are before the courts currently, and because of the commitments of the Constitution, Indigenous communities are hopeful that although land claims issues will take a long time to resolve, there will ultimately be some form of justice. And also Indigenous communities are hopeful that there is now currently before us the possibility of a return to self-government on the table in Canadian society. Just to refresh our memory, remember way back in the Imperial Proclamation of 1789, the British Crown promised that Indigenous communities would be entitled to retain self-government. You do your thing, we'll do ours over here as our Anglo-speaking cultural group. You do yours, we'll respect each other, we'll be friends, and you'll govern yourselves. But that, of course, our first Prime Minister, very shortly after Confederation, led the way to pass legislation which would take away self-government for Indigenous communities. But that is now back on the table. And in my view, as someone who kind of works in these areas, I do believe that the return to self-government is the only way to resolve the harms of history in terms of Indigenous communities. And we know, so we've seen all of this shift that's happening. We've seen newcomer groups that have actually had huge movement forward, largely against very difficult odds and through their own initiative and their community courage and initiative. But we see that racism still persists really at the systemic and personal level in Canadian society in ways which are both pervasive and hard to get at. I would argue as well, there is still legalized racism in some forms. You'll remember when we talked in our earlier conversation about Islamophobia, and we looked at the work that was considering the marginalization of Islamic communities in terms of taking away the right of all people to wear religious symbols in Quebec, or the incarceration of overrepresentation of Islamic community members in incarceration under terror legislation, which allows people to be held without charges for years and years and years, without the access to the Bill of Rights in the same way that other Canadians have. So there's still all kinds of things in there that also touch on legalized racism. But we have a framework now. We have a constitutional framework which we can hold ourselves accountable to. That's one big piece. And the other big piece is a growing awareness and consciousness that in a society like ours, which hopes to uphold well-being for all community members, there's an importance in holding ourselves accountable to working together to help make that possible for all Canadians. So then how does the next stage of change happen? And that's one of the things I want us to look at now as we move a little bit beyond the whole idea of multiculturalism into some new ideas about what living with diversity looks like, which are different than the old ideas of multiculturalism. So we want to look also at equity and anti-racism practice. So just to step back a moment, we introduced the idea of multiculturalism and the Canadian mosaic in week 1. But what I want to just flag for us now, and the book talks about, are some of the limitations of multiculturalism in Canada. One of the challenges that Canada has had with the idea of multiculturalism is that we don't have a really strong national identity. So then, when one does not have a strong national identity, understanding what a diverse identity in relation to that looks like has been very confusing and muddied. So what has happened then, without a strong national identity, which in many ways is a very good thing, it's meant that we've talked about diversity in ways which means that we just put diversity up against a norm, and the norm becomes Anglo-speaking white culture in ways that have not fully empowered our neighbors, as we've seen in the preceding 2 weeks. The second thing I want to flag is the notion of passivity in the philosophy of multiculturalism. Embedded in the notion of multiculturalism is tolerance. Okay, we're going to tolerate difference. We're going to let you do your thing. We'll tolerate that difference. And we haven't lived up to that very well. But even the idea of it, the passivity of it, the notion of tolerance, it doesn't mean appreciation. It doesn't mean engagement. It doesn't mean welcome and synergy. It means tolerance, which is a much more lukewarm principle in terms of the affirmation of value in diversity. So then all of those things are set beside the fact that we also have had active racism in actual practice, both legalized, personal, and also systemic, in the ordering of our society. And that has made a bit of a mockery of the notion of a you be you and all be me and we'll all live in harmony, because we haven't actually practiced it because of the undercurrents of racism that have been there that we've been exploring. And in response then, what we've often seen in response to racism or exclusion is that newcomer groups and original groups have drawn tighter boundaries around their community. So we'll see, for example, if we have a newcomer group that moves from, I'll think of the Punjab, which is one place where I have been and visited, and where in the Punjab, the people I visited talk about the importance of people being together in community. So there's a high concentration of folks from the Punjab who have moved to the Brampton area. And in the Punjab, folks talk about that because you go where other people share your values and your customs. But that what often happens because of some of the racism and exclusion that people experience when they get there is that the boundaries are built around newcomer groups to keep others out and themselves in. So you see communities of cultural and ethnic identification actually building their own walls to protect their community from external onslaught, but also then creating separate worlds. And so you have this notion of ethnic difference needing to be protected. And what we have are a group of cultural practices and peoples and languages and traditions that live in isolation from each other rather than engagement. So what I want to introduce for us, and it's what we introduce in the book, is the idea of interculturalism. So we're going to play with a couple of terms here. The first one is interculturalism as a social imaginary, a way of thinking about how we live with difference that's different than the idea of multiculturalism. Because multiculturalism means I'm going to be me, you be you, just do your thing, I'll do my thing, and we'll kind of walk beside each other, but we won't engage. But interculturalism is a much, much more complex practice, but much richer and much more in keeping with, I would think, some of our Christian thinking about how diversity lives well in the world. So the idea of interculturalism is that it's a dynamic engagement. So we have a dynamic engagement of each other and our differences. And from that engagement of difference, we actually imagine what Canada is going to look like if we're all working together to try and figure out what that Canada should be. So why interculturalism? I've got the idea of third space here. I'll jump to that bottom point, the goal. So the goal of this would be, there's a theoretician, I don't know if we've talked about him before, which his name is Edward Soja, and he talks about third space. In other words, there's A and there's B, and we act together, we think, and we come up with C. So in assimilation, you've got A and B, and A requires that B become like A. In multiculturalism, we have A and B living beside each other, but not much agreement and not much crossover. In third space, you get A plus B, you make a new thing called C. So this idea of interculturalism as a dynamic, evolving social conversation challenges the idea of self-segregation or the self-segregation tendencies within cultures. We stay with our own group and invites all of us to move beyond passive acceptance of the other toward not only mutual understanding, but a participatory development of a new social imaginary, a new way of talking about who we are going to be together as a society. So together we'll define what our values are, what our norms will be, what our practices and expectations of each other will be. So another term we want to introduce, and it's a fairly old-fashioned term, but I want to reclaim it here because I think pluralism as a modus operandi is really necessary to the realization of interculturalism in our society. So pluralism isn't just about diversity. Usually, the old days we talked about pluralism as, a lot of different things, a lot of different groups, different religions. Michael Ingham, you'll recall from the Diocese of New Westminster, wrote a book on differing religions, and he used pluralism as his model. But pluralism as just difference is inadequate. What this new frame invites us to is to think of energetic engagement with diversity and diversities with each other. Pluralism isn't just tolerance, but it's active seeking understanding across difference. So if we think in religious terms, for example, the Christians would sit down with the Sikh and the Baha'i and Muslim and Christian neighbors and try and understand things. We might not agree, but at least we begin the conversation in the dynamic of listening to each other and trying to understand. So pluralism then is also not just tolerance, it's not relativism. So it's not, well, I believe this and everything is some version of this, right? Everything is some relative version of what I believe, but rather it's an encounter of commitments. And the idea is that if we dialogue sufficiently with each other, we will have an encounter of our core commitments such that we can understand each other in new ways. And from that, then develop agreed upon ways of being in our society. So in a way, then, another new term, we're going to talk about civic nationalism as a positive. So I want to introduce the idea of nationalism as both a negative and a positive. Nationalism, of course, we know what that is. National pride developed in the 19th century, really, circa Bismarck and his attempt to unify Germany and the German republics. But nationalism is really a necessary companion to the idea of a cohesive identity, but ethnic nationalism too tightly prescribed divides people. It creates mistrust, it provides competition and adversarial stances. So if we see in the positive way, we think of the Olympics or something like that, where we compete and it's a global community and we have national pride, but we also see national pride causing things like Putin's aggression into the Ukraine. So Russia thinks the Ukraine should be back with Russia because it's part of a national identity that's very tightly prescribed. And so they go and say, we're going to take that back because it doesn't fit for us to have you on the outside of us. You belong with us. So nationalism in this sense, or ethnic nationalism, has been the source of most wars in some form or another. Religion and ethnic nationalism are under most of the global conflicts of the last 150 years or so. But the idea of civic nationalism is actually construed here in terms of a future social imaginary as a positive. Civic nationalism really invites all members of a society to define themselves, ourselves, through shared adherence to a common set of values, set of ideas and beliefs, which we as a state define together. So in Canada, with our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we've said that core principles must preserve individual freedoms, but also must include certain principles such as equality, justice, fairness, and inclusion, which our Charter of Rights talks about. So a Canadian based on civic nationalism wouldn't have a geographic or political boundary around who we are, but a set of shared values around who we are. So then with civic nationalism, the idea of the shared values, norms, and ideals to which a society adheres, really the only way to get there is through the notion of an intercultural model that we've been talking about. The intercultural model, fueled by a commitment to dynamic pluralism, allows us to articulate what these values might be. It's a little scary. I mean, it's a little scary because shared values with our neighbor are not going to be necessarily the values as we've articulated them in the past. So there's a risk of having to be changed when one encounters difference. And I think that's one of the challenges we've had with race and racism in Canada throughout the story, which is that there is a fear of difference and the other that has led us in particular pathways. So Canada's form of constitutional structure, remember our living tree, really lends itself, sorry for the typo, to an ever evolving adaptation of civic society through the inclusion of multiple voices in the act of constitutional adaptation through legal processes. So this year with this frame, this is really the vision of where we might go beyond multiculturalism. In other words, using our legal processes, adapting our constitution through the genuine inclusion of multiple voices and conversations which are aimed at learning each other. So then that is the model that the book articulates in terms of a new Canadian social imaginary, which is that this imaginary of who we're going to be isn't done yet. We don't know what it will be because we have not really learned the practices yet of interculturalism. So intercultural discourse then leads to the idea of a shared civic national identity supported through the adherence to adaptive constitutional practices and agreed upon cultural norms. So this slide just kind of sums these things up in terms of where to from here, as argued by the book, in terms of defining a new social imaginary from our existing situation and building on emerging strengths. So the first then is the philosophical frame of interculturalism shaped by pluralism rather than multiculturalism. The second piece is the notion of a positive nationalism, which we're calling here in the book civic nationalism rather than ethnic nationalism. Thirdly, the really central importance in developing that future of a written constitution, which can adapt through legal challenge. And then the fourth piece, which we haven't talked about much here, but which is where the rubber hits the road in terms of whether or not we get to wear our hijab or our cross in public, or whether we have the right to raise our children according to our own religious practice, et cetera. And it's the notion of public policy and also social practice. So public policy then needs to constantly tend the work of development so that agreed upon values and norms as articulated in our evolving constitution and in the arena of social discourse are reflected in the policies that we practice and in the ways in which we live together in terms of social convention. So keeping my eye on the time, I want to just introduce a couple of other things. I want to look at equity and anti-racism. The book looks at these also in terms of necessary players in this conversation of how we get from here to there in terms of our new social imaginary. And this slide really is just trying to give a visual in terms of the difference between equality and equity. So in our former world, we talked about equality, now using exclusive language, all people, all men are created equal. Well, the truth of the matter is that was a philosophical idea to which we aspire. But given our history and story of white dominance and Western dominance, Anglo dominance, and the ways in which we have treated newcomer groups and original peoples, there actually isn't equality. The only way for us to get to equality, which would be everybody being able to see over the fence to watch the baseball game, is measures which need to be implemented to help those who have started in a different place find a way to all be able to see over the fence together. So the person who can see over the fence by standing on their two legs or perhaps representing the icon of privilege, those folks who have been born, like as I have been, with privilege, don't need X, Y, and Z because I can see over the fence and get there. Now, of course, I'm an equity seeking group, which is a woman as well. So then we might put one stool under in terms of how we address the fact that having been a woman in a male dominated church in terms of leadership in the last 30 years, or a male dominated academy in the last 30 years, what is needed to help me be able to see over the fence? So as a white Anglo, I can see over the fence, but then the fence gets higher with gender. We need to make some adjustment underneath. And then if I happen to be a newcomer population or a population with not a newcomer, but has been here for a newcomer group that's been here for 200 years, thinking of Black Canadians, for example, or original Canadians who have been here for over 14,000 years in terms of it, but have been, by the way, the legal frameworks have disempowered people and disenfranchised people quite legally and literally. What needs to happen to our policies, to our social practices, and to our laws to enable all of us to be able to be participating in the same game, if you will. So the difference between equality and equity. So the new world will have to take account of equity practices. And then finally, anti-racism. So we hear anti-racism all the time. It's especially in my world, anti-racism is a daily conversation. Institutions of my type are very committed to it. The church is also embracing the language of anti-racism. The question is, what does it look like? So I wanted to just give us some simple way of looking into the whole notion of anti-racist practice that might help us in terms of our discipleship thinking and conversation, and address the question of what does it look in terms of the transformation of our mind in the spirit of God as we are looking at all of this, what does it mean? So the first thing I thought that might be helpful is for us to think of anti-racism not as a noun, but as a verb. It really isn't a noun. Anti-racism is not a thing out there. It's a practice. It's a way of being. It's a way constantly of choosing and acting. So I anti-racism. And that, I think, is for me is a helpful way of thinking about it. This is something that has to be done, has to be practiced, has to be chosen, has to be acted out in every interaction that we have where there is going to be some discourse of race in the conversation. Excuse me. So I put here a list of anti-racism practices. But what I want us to do is really reflect on anti-racism practices as spiritual disciplines. Because when you look at what I have here, there is absolutely nothing on this list which has not already been taught as a Christian spiritual discipline for centuries. From our earliest New Testament church forward, the principles that we're talking about here are basic Christian disciple practices. So the first one is education. We need to learn. well, as Christians, we need to learn our faith, we need to learn each other. So as we apply this principle of education and coming to awareness and deepening in consciousness, in Christian terms, we have traditionally talked about that as coming to consciousness awareness in our faith, deepening our faith. In an anti-racism practice, this is coming to consciousness and awareness through education around the ways in which we are not living our model of respect and welcome for all human beings in our society. And that's what we've been doing for these 3 weeks together. We've been educating ourselves. We've been coming to consciousness about how our history is not quite what we thought it is, and how our current situation has many things that still need to be tended and changed. Second is intention. Anti-racism and Christian faith do not happen without intention. I might want to be a Christian, but if I am not intentional with my Christianity, I forget my Christianity. If it is not a daily awareness for me and how I practice it, what does it mean to turn my life to God every day? It's very analogous to the practice of intentional anti-racism. And how can I practice, live with anti-racism as a verb, an essential part of me, if I'm not intentional about it? So every interaction in the grocery store, in the classroom, in our congregations, we need the intention not only to be disciples, we need the intention to live anti-racism practice. A third practice, which I think is absolutely necessary in anti-racism work, is courage. It takes a lot of courage. If the world has been this way and we understand through our coming to consciousness that it needs to be that way, and all of our friends and neighbors really don't want it to be that way, where do we go with that? Well, we need courage. We need courage to live a Christian ethic, which is not the same as a dominant culture ethic. It is not. It does not share the same values of dominant culture. It just simply does not. And neither does anti-racism. Anti-racism work does not share the values of dominant culture. It's challenging the values and privilege of dominant culture. So very analogous. Thirdly, respect. Anti-racism practice absolutely embraces the notion that every human being is worthy of respect. Every human being is equally valued. And of course, we know that that's a core Christian value. Humanism, which gave birth to secularism through the Enlightenment, came from Christian values. The Christians understood Imago Dei, we're all made in the image of God. We are all precious, loved by God, come from goodness, are invited home to health and well-being and healing. And so the respect that we see as a core practice of the anti-racism movement is essentially a Christian practice that's 2,000 years old. We see it in other faith traditions as well, absolutely, but we are Christians. So I'm talking in the frame of Christian practice here. The problem is, of course, what we've seen in these 3 sessions is that way we have lived our Christianity as churches has not embraced and embodied the notion of respect for all. As we have attempted to impose our values and our norms and our religion on other people, perhaps with the most well-meaning intentions, we have paved a road for ourselves. That was one of my mother's favorite expressions: good intentions pave the road to hell. We have actually led ourselves away from this core principle and maxim of the Christian faith. Allyship. Well, that's a fancy anti-racist word, which means we got to be together. We've got to stand with each other. And the Christians know all about that. We are invited by the gospel to stand with the disenfranchised. When you fed, when you clothed, when you gave a drink, when you stopped, the Good Samaritan, that is allyship. That is seeing in a very particular way that racism is coloring the story of Canadian society in a way which means that people are being harmed. So as with the Good Samaritan, we are invited in anti-racism to become allies through our decisions, through our opinions, through our public positions, through our voting, allies of those who are asking that they be treated with respect and dignity and equitably, despite the color of their skin, race, ethnicity, gender orientation, etc. Allyship. And then finally, love. If you read the anti-racism literature, love as empathy, compassion, altruism is a core principle of the anti-racism movement. It effectively means choosing the other ahead of the self. If we are to construct a world where our neighbor can actually see over the fence with us, we may have actually to give our box to our neighbor to stand on so that they can get up. In someone's a position like mine where that comes up, for example, there was just as a concrete example of what this looks like in terms of anti-racism work. There was a search committee to choose the new president for the University of Waterloo. The affiliated and federated institutions had one representative to be chosen from the presidents. That I was the representative. I'm a person of dominant culture and experience. The Black Faculty Caucus raised the question about how would there be, there were no Black people on the search committee to choose the new president of the university. But the rules of the university meant that there was no way to, by the policy of who should be on the committee, give a spot to a person of color on that committee. What the AFU heads decided to do was actually nominate, rather than one of the heads. I was on the committee. We chose a member of the Black Faculty Caucus. They chose the person and they became our person on the committee. That was an anti-racism practice. Sometimes we have to uncheck our own privilege to actually love the possibility of a more just future and love the other. So altruism would be a way that the Christians talk about this. So then that's my view in terms of where this whole story is going, that anti-racism per se is absolutely a Christian praxis. It is in keeping with everything we say that the gospel invites us to in terms of love of the other and respect and care for the other, and the interconnectedness of all of us. And I want to, as we break for our conversation and discussion, I want to leave us with that question, because we know we started with, in our very first week, the biblical teaching. That was our first teaching for week 1. We are all one in Christ Jesus, no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who is the one? Because the questions of racism in our society mean that the other is quite often not Christian. And for us to live according to the ethic of welcome of all and respect for all in our society, Christianity, by assuming that we needed to convert everybody to our way of seeing things, actually caused the harm and laid the basis for a Christian, nominally Christian society from the very beginning, which we see echoed even in the Bill of Rights in 1960, to actually become a racist society. So the question I leave us with as we reflect together is, who is the one if we aren't all Christians? Thank you.
Sam, would you like me to stop recording?
Yeah.